Hi, I'm Marcus Winters. I'm an associate professor at BU Wheelock and the faculty director for the Wheelock Educational Policy Center. I'm here to give a brief presentation of my paper with Brian Casita and Aiki Cho entitled The Impact of Principal Attrition and Replacement on Indicators of School Quality. So transitions to new principals are common, especially within urban public schools, and potentially might be disruptive to a school's culture and operations. There's some recent research finding that principal transitions negatively impact student performance, but questions remain about whether principal transitions are inherently disruptive or if the impact of changing principals depends on the context surrounding the outgoing or the incoming principal. So we use longitudinal data from New York City to evaluate the impact of principal mobility on public schools and add to our understanding of the nature of principal effects. In addition to test score growth and teacher turnover, we look at the impacts of principal changes within the school as measured by a rich set of school environment and climate indicators. And this is important because we believe that most of a principal's contribution to a school is likely indirect. It's going to come through impacting the school culture and its environment. We also look at whether the impact of a principal transition depends on whether the principal was hired from outside the school or was promoted internally. It's not totally obvious whether one type of transition is more disruptive than the other. For example, an internal promotion could be less disruptive if current teachers and staff are familiar with the person. But on the other hand, externally hired principals might bring innovative ideas that an internal candidate wouldn't. So this slide illustrates our analysis for the effect of principal transitions on student test score levels and gains, and also on teacher turnover. The dots represent the estimate, and the line going through the dots is the 95% confidence interval. The green is the effect of any transition, orange is the effect of an internal hire, and blue is the effect of an external hire. The figure shows the average school's performance in years immediately before and following a principal transition. So all comparisons are relative to the year before a new principal arrives. So we can think of the horizontal line at 0 as the effect in the previous principal's final year. So if the estimate for the first year is at the 0 line, it means that on average, the school did as well on that measure in the new principal's first year than it did in the previous principal's last year. And if the estimate in the first year is above the 0 line, it means that in the new principal's first year, on average, a school tends to do better on that outcome than in the previous principal's last year. So take a look at the results of student performance score. This is a measure of test score levels within the school. Look at the green line, which represents any transition, regardless of if the new principal is internally promoted or was externally hired. First, we see that there's no difference in performance within the school in any of the 3 years leading up to the principal change. Then, in the new principal's first year, we see a sudden and meaningful drop in student performance. This decline in student performance stays within the school for several years following the change. This pattern of results suggests that a principal transition, on average, caused a decline in student performance within the school. Now, notice that for the test score outcomes, the pattern is fairly similar for schools that transition to a new principal that was promoted from within, so the blue line, or if the principal was hired from outside the school, the orange line. But when we look at the results for teacher turnover, what we see is a large increase in turnover when an externally hired principal comes in, but not when a new principal is promoted from within. The next set of results contributes to this story. So the outcome here are constructs related to the school's environment, their level of trust, order, and discipline, and the leader's vision for the school that come from teacher responses to an annual survey given in New York City. So interestingly, teachers report that the school's environment, according to these measures, gets worse when the new principal is hired from outside the school. But we don't see a similar effect when the principal is promoted from within. But in fact, if anything, teachers report that the environment gets a little bit better when someone is internally promoted to be the principal. So overall, principal transitions disrupt student learning, regardless of whether the new principal is hired from outside or promoted from within. Not all principal transitions can be avoided, of course, but reducing them is a valuable policy goal. When we think further about implications of these results, we're left with a bit of a conundrum that's worthy of some additional research and consideration. Teachers appear to respond to the two types of transitions very differently. They find externally hired new principals to be disruptive to the environment, but not when the principal is one of their colleagues who's promoted. They don't find this disruptive to the environment. This result calls into question the mechanisms of principal impacts on student learning. So that is, if principals have their impact through the school's environment, then we'd probably expect to see transitions that don't harm the environment to also not reduce student learning. But that's not what we see here. We see similar effects on student learning, but different effects from the different types of transition on these impacts, on these measures of the environment. There's a couple notable limitations of our analysis that are worth keeping in mind. First, we don't actually observe changes in the school's environment, but rather we observe the teacher responses to survey questions about the school's environment. Perhaps teachers just perceive the environment differently, but all transitions have similar impacts on the school's environment. That said, the fact that we also find that different types of transitions have different effects on actual teacher mobility suggests that our environmental findings might represent something real after all. Second, we should note that our results speak to the average effect of these types of transitions, each of these separate types of transitions, but schools still need to take into context into account. We shouldn't look at this result and say that all schools should make internal promotions because they don't disrupt the environment, for example. If a school doesn't have a good internal candidate, then the external candidate could still be the right move.